Hello everyone, this is Ifeyinwa. Welcome to Finding Africa, to explore and share the beauty of Africa, starting with folk stories from southern Nigeria. The Tortoise with a Pretty Daughter. There was once a king who was very powerful. He had great influence over the wild beasts and animals. Now the tortoise was looked upon as the wisest of all beasts and men. This king had a son named Ifeyinwa, to whom he gave 50 young girls as wives. But the prince did not like any of them. The king was very angry at this and made a law that if any man had a daughter who was finer than the prince's wives, and who found favor in his son's eyes, the girl herself and her father and mother should be killed. Now, about this time, the tortoise and his wife had a daughter who was very beautiful. The mother thought it was not safe to keep such a fine child, as the prince might fall in love with her, so she told her husband that her daughter ought to be killed and thrown away into the bush. The tortoise, however, was unwilling and hid her until she was 3 years old. One day, when both the tortoise and his wife were away on their farm, the king's son happened to be hunting near their house and saw a bird perched on top of the fence round the house. The bird was watching the little girl and was so entranced with her beauty that he did not notice the prince coming. The prince shot the bird with his bow and arrow, and it dropped inside the fence, so the prince sent his servant to gather it. While the servant was looking for the bird, he came across the little girl and was so struck with her form that he immediately returned to his master and told him what he had seen. The prince then broke down the fence and found the child and fell in love with her at once. He stayed and talked with her for a long time until at last she agreed to become his wife. He then went home but concealed from his father the fact that he had fallen in love with the beautiful daughter of the tortoise. But the next morning he sent for the treasurer and got 60 pieces of cloth and 300 rods, and sent them to the tortoise. Then in the early afternoon, he went down to the tortoise's house and told him that he wished to marry his daughter. The tortoise saw at once that what he had dreaded had come to pass, and that his life was in danger. So he told the prince that if the king knew, he would kill not only himself, the tortoise, but also his wife and daughter. The prince replied that he would be killed himself before he allowed the tortoise and his wife and daughter to be killed. Eventually, after much argument, the tortoise consented and agreed to hand his daughter to the prince as his wife when she arrived at the proper age. Then the prince went home and told his mother what he had done. She was in great distress at the thought that she would lose her son, of whom she was very proud, as she knew that when the king heard of his son's disobedience, he would kill him. However, the queen, although she knew how angry her husband would be, wanted her son to marry the girl he had fallen in love with. So she went to the tortoise and gave him some money, clothes, yams, and palm oil as further dowry on her son's behalf, in order that the tortoise should not give his daughter to another man. For the next 5 years, the prince was constantly with the tortoise's daughter, whose name was Adet. And when she was about to be put in the fatting house, the prince told his father that he was going to take Adet as his wife. On hearing this, the king was very angry and sent word all round his kingdom that all people should come on a certain day to the marketplace to hear the palaver. When the appointed day arrived, the marketplace was quite full of people, and the stones belonging to the king and queen were placed in the middle of the marketplace. When the king and queen arrived, all the people stood up and greeted them, and they then sat down on their stones. The king then told his attendants to bring the girl Adet before him. When she arrived, the king was quite astonished at her beauty. He then told the people that he had sent for them to tell them that he was very angry with his son for disobeying him and taking Adet as his wife without his knowledge. But that now he had seen her himself, he had to acknowledge that she was very beautiful and that his son had made a good choice. He would therefore forgive his son. When the people saw the girl, they agreed that she was very fine and quite worthy of being the prince's wife, and begged the king to cancel the law he had made altogether, and the king agreed. And as the law had been made under the Ebo law, he sent for 8 Ebos and told them that the order was cancelled throughout his kingdom, and that for the future no one would be killed who had a daughter more beautiful than the prince's wives, and gave the Ebos palm wine and money to remove the law and sent them away. Then he declared that the Tortoise's daughter, Adet, should marry his son, and he made them marry the same day. A great feast was then given, which lasted for 50 days, and the king killed 5 cows and gave all the people plenty of fufu and palm oil chop, and placed a large number of pots of palm wine in the streets for the people to drink as they liked. The women brought a big plate to the king's compound, and there was singing and dancing kept up day and night during the whole time. The prince and his companions also played in the market square. When the feast was over, the king gave half of his kingdom to the Tortoise to rule over and 300 slaves to work on his farm. The prince also gave his father-in-law 200 women and 100 girls to work for him. So the Tortoise became one of the richest men in the kingdom. The prince and his wife lived together for a good many years until the king died, when the prince ruled in his place. And all this shows that the tortoise is the wisest of all men and animals. Moral: always follow your heart, and you will have the power to change the world. How a hunter obtained money from his friends the leopard, goat, bush cat, and cock, and how he got out of repaying them. Many years ago, there was a Calabar hunter called Ifeyinwa who lived in the bush, killed plenty of animals, and made much money. Everyone in the country knew him, and one of his best friends was a man called Okun, who lived near him. But Ifeyinwa was very extravagant and spent much money in eating and drinking with everyone until at last he became quite poor. So he had to go out hunting again. But now his good luck seemed to have deserted him. For although he worked hard and hunted day and night, he could not succeed in killing anything. One day, as he was very hungry, he went to his friend Okun and borrowed 200 rods from him and told him to come to his house on a certain day to get his money. And he told him to bring his gun loaded with him. Now, some time before this, Ifeyinwa had made friends with a leopard and a bush cat, whom he had met in the forest whilst on one of his hunting expeditions. And he had also made friends with a goat and a cock at a farm where he had stayed for the night. But though Ifeyinwa had borrowed the money from Okun, he could not think how he was to repay it on the day he had promised. At last, however, he thought of a plan, and on the next day he went to his friend, the Leopard, and asked him to lend him 200 rods, promising to return the amount to him on the same day as he had promised to pay Okun. And he also told the Leopard that if he were absent when he came for his money, he could kill anything he saw in the house and eat it. The Leopard was then to wait until the hunter arrived, when he would pay him the money, and to this the Leopard agreed. The hunter then went to his friend the goat and borrowed 200 rods from him in the same way. Ifeyinwa also went to his friends the bush cat and the cock and borrowed 200 rods from each of them on the same conditions, and told each of them that if he were absent when they arrived, they could kill and eat anything they found about the place. When the appointed day arrived, the hunter spread some corn on the ground and then went away and left the house deserted. Very early in the morning, soon after he had begun to crow, the cock remembered what the hunter had told him and walked over to the hunter's house, but found no one there. On looking round, however, he saw some corn on the ground, and being hungry, he commenced to eat. About this time, the bush cat also arrived, and not finding the hunter at home, he too looked about, and very soon he espied the cock, who was busy picking up the grains of corn. So the bush cat went up very softly behind and pounced on the cock and killed him at once and began to eat him. By this time, the goat had come for his money, but not finding his friend, he walked about until he came upon the bush cat, who was so intent upon his meal off the cock that he did not notice the goat approaching. And the goat, being in a rather bad temper at not getting his money, at once charged at the bush cat and knocked him over, butting him with his horns. This the bush cat did not like at all. So, as he was not big enough to fight the goat, he picked up the remains of the cock and ran off with it to the bush, and so lost his money, as he did not await the arrival of the hunter. The goat was thus left master of the situation and started bleating, and this noise attracted the attention of the leopard, who was on his way to receive payment from the hunter. As he got nearer, the smell of goat became very strong, and being hungry, for he had not eaten anything for some time, he approached the goat very carefully. Not seeing anyone about, he stalked the goat and got nearer and nearer until he was within springing distance. The goat, in the meantime, was grazing quietly, quite unsuspicious of any danger, as he was in his friend, the hunter's compound. Now and then he would say "Bah," but most of the time he was busy eating the young grass and picking up the leaves which had fallen from a tree of which he was very fond. Suddenly, the leopard sprang at the goat and with one crunch at the neck brought him down. The goat was dead almost at once, and the leopard started on his meal. It was now about 8 o'clock in the morning, and Okun, the hunter's friend, having had his early morning meal, went out with his gun to receive payment of the 200 rods he had lent to the hunter. When he got close to the house, he heard a crunching sound, and being a hunter himself, he approached very cautiously. and looking over the fence saw the leopard only a few yards off, busily engaged eating the goat. He took careful aim at the leopard and fired, whereupon the leopard rolled over dead. The death of the leopard meant that 4 of the hunter's creditors were now disposed of, as the bushcat had killed the cock. The goat had driven the bushcat away, who thus forfeited his claim. And in his turn, the goat had been killed by the leopard, who had just been slain by Okun. This meant a saving of 800 rods to Ifeyinwa. But he was not content with this, and directly he heard the report of the gun, he ran out from where he had been hiding all the time and found the leopard lying dead with Okun standing over it. Then, in very strong language, Ifeyinwa began to upbraid his friend and asked him why he had killed his old friend the leopard, that nothing would satisfy him but that he should report the whole matter to the king, who would no doubt deal with him as he thought fit. When Ifeyinwa said this, Okun was frightened and begged him not to say anything more about the matter, as the king would be angry. But the hunter was obdurate and refused to listen to him, and at last Okun said, "If you would allow the whole thing to drop, and will say no more about it, I will make you a present of the 200 rods you borrowed from me." This was just what Ifeyinwa wanted, but still he did not give in at once. Eventually, however, he agreed and told Okun he might go, and that he would bury the body of his friend, the leopard. Directly Okun had gone, instead of burying the body, Ifeyinwa dragged it inside the house and skinned it very carefully. The skin he put out to dry in the sun and covered it with wood ash, and the body he ate. When the skin was well cured, the hunter took it to a distant market where he sold it for much money. And now, whenever the bushcat sees a cock, he always kills it, and does so by right, as he takes the cock in part payment of the 200 rods which the hunter never paid him. Moral: be careful who you lend money to. A desperate person will try to kill or get rid of you to avoid repayment. The woman with 2 skins. Eyamba I of Calabar was a very powerful king. He fought and conquered all the surrounding countries, killing all the old men and women, but the able-bodied men and girls he caught and brought back as slaves, and they worked on the farms until they died. This king had 200 wives, but none of them had borne a son to him. His subjects, seeing that he was becoming an old man, begged him to marry one of the spider's daughters, as they always had plenty of children. But when the king saw the spider's daughter, he did not like her, as she was ugly, and the people said it was because her mother had had so many children at the same time. However, in order to please his people, he married the ugly girl and placed her among his other wives. But they all complained because she was so ugly and said she could not live with them. The king therefore built her a separate house for herself, where she was given food and drink the same as the other wives. Everyone jeered at her on account of her ugliness, but she was not really ugly but beautiful, as she was born with 2 skins, and at her birth, her mother was made to promise that she should never remove the ugly skin until a certain time arrived, save only during the night, and that she must put it on again before dawn. Now, the king's head wife knew this, and was very fearful lest the king should find it out and fall in love with the spider's daughter. So she went to a juju man and offered him 200 rods to make a potion that would make the king forget altogether that the spider's daughter was his wife. This the juju man finally consented to do, after much haggling over the price, for 350 rods, and he made up some medicine which the head wife mixed with the king's food. For some months, this had the effect of making the king forget the spider's daughter, and he used to pass quite close to her and without recognizing her in any way. When 4 months had elapsed and the king had not once sent for Adiaha, for that was the name of the spider's daughter, she began to get tired and went back to her parents. Her father, the spider, then took her to another juju man, who, by making spells and casting lots, very soon discovered that it was the king's head wife who had made the juju and had enchanted the king so that he would not look at Adiaha. He therefore told the spider that Adiaha should give the king some medicine which he would prepare, which would make the king remember her. He prepared the medicine for which the spider had to pay a large sum of money. And that very day, Adiaha made a small dish of food into which she had placed the medicine, and presented it to the king. Directly he had eaten the dish, his eyes were open, and he recognized his wife, and told her to come to him that very evening. So in the afternoon, being very joyful, she went down to the river and washed, and when she returned, she put on her best cloth and went to the king's palace. Directly it was dark and all the lights were out, she pulled off her ugly skin, and the king saw how beautiful she was, and was very pleased with her. But when the cock crowed, Adiaha pulled on her ugly skin again and went back to her own house. This she did for 4 nights running, always taking the ugly skin off in the dark and leaving before daylight in the morning. In course of time, to the great surprise of all the people, and particularly of the king's 200 wives, she gave birth to a son. But what surprised them most of all was that only one son was born, whereas her mother had always had a great many children at a time, generally about 50. The king's head wife became more jealous than ever when Adiaha had a son. So she went again to the juju man, and by giving him a large present, induced him to give her some medicine, which would make the king sick and forget his son. And the medicine would then make the king go to the juju man, who would tell him that it was his son who had made him sick, as he wanted to reign instead of his father. The juju man would also tell the king that if he wanted to recover, he must throw his son away into the water. And the king, when he had taken the medicine, went to the juju man, who told him everything as had been arranged with the head wife. But at first, the king did not want to destroy his son. Then his chief subjects begged him to throw his son away and said that perhaps in a year's time he might get another son. So the king at last agreed and threw his son into the river, at which the mother grieved and cried bitterly. Then the head wife went again to the juju man and got more medicine, which made the king forget Adiaha for 3 years, during which time she was in mourning for her son. She then returned to her father, and he got some more medicine from his juju man, which Adiaha gave to the king. And the king knew her and called her to him again, and she lived with him as before. Now, the juju who had helped Adiaha's father, the spider, was a water juju, and he was ready when the king threw his son into the water and saved his life, and took him home and kept him alive. And the boy grew up very strong. After a time, Adiaha gave birth to a daughter, and her, the jealous wife, also persuaded the king to throw away. It took a longer time to persuade him, but at last he agreed and threw his daughter into the water too and forgot Adiaha again. But the water juju was ready again, and when he had saved the little girl, he thought the time had arrived to punish the action of the jealous wife. So he went about amongst the head young men and persuaded them to hold a wrestling match in the marketplace every week. This was done, and the water juju told the king's son, who had become very strong and was very like to his father in appearance, that he should go and wrestle, and that no one would be able to stand up before him. It was then arranged that there should be a grand wrestling match to which all the strongest men in the country were invited, and the king promised to attend with his head wife. On the day of the match, the water juju told the king's son that he need not be in the least afraid, and that his juju was so powerful that even the strongest and best wrestlers in the country would not be able to stand up against him for even a few minutes. All the people of the country came to see the great contest, to the winner of which the king had promised to present prizes of cloth and money, and all the strongest men came. When they saw the king's son, whom nobody knew, they laughed and said, "Who is this small boy? He can have no chance against us." But when they came to wrestle, they very soon found that they were no match for him. The boy was very strong indeed, beautifully made and good to look upon, and all the people were surprised to see how like he was to the king. After wrestling for the greater part of the day, the king's son was declared the winner, having thrown everyone who had stood up against him. In fact, some of his opponents had been badly hurt and had their arms or ribs broken owing to the tremendous strength of the boy. After the match was over, the king presented him with cloth and money and invited him to dine with him in the evening. The boy gladly accepted his father's invitation, and after he had had a good wash in the river, put on his cloth and went up to the palace, where he found the head chiefs of the country and some of the king's most favored wives. They then sat down to their meal, and the king had his own son, whom he did not know, sitting next to him. On the other side of the boy sat the jealous wife, who had been the cause of all the trouble. All through the dinner, this woman did her best to make friends with the boy, with whom she had fallen violently in love on account of his beautiful appearance, his strength, and his being the best wrestler in the country. The woman thought to herself, "I will have this boy as my husband is now an old man and will surely soon die." The boy, however, who was as wise as he was strong, was quite aware of everything the jealous woman had done, and although he pretended to be very flattered at the advances of the king's head wife, he did not respond very readily and went home as soon as he could. When he returned to the water juju's house, he told him everything that had happened, and the water juju said, "As you are now in high favor with the king, you must go to him tomorrow and beg a favor from him. The favor you will ask is that all the country shall be called together, and that a certain case shall be tried, and that when the case is finished, the man or woman who is found to be in the wrong shall be killed by the Egbos before all the people. So, the following morning, the boy went to the king, who readily granted his request, and at once sent all round the country appointing a day for all the people to come in and hear the case tried. Then the boy went back to the water juju, who told him to go to his mother and tell her who he was, and that when the day of the trial arrived, she was to take off her ugly skin and appear in all her beauty, for the time had come when she need no longer wear it. This the son did. When the day of the trial arrived, Adiaha sat in a corner of the square, and nobody recognized the beautiful stranger as the spider's daughter. Her son then sat down next to her and brought his sister with him. Immediately his mother saw her, she said, "This must be my daughter, whom I have long mourned as dead," and embraced her most affectionately. The king and his head wife then arrived and sat on their stones in the middle of the square, all the people saluting them with the usual greetings. The king then addressed the people and said that he had called them together to hear a strong palaver at the request of the young man who had been the victor of the wrestling, and who had promised that if the case went against him, he would offer up his life to the Egbo. The king also said that if, on the other hand, the case was decided in the boy's favor, then the other party would be killed, even though it were himself or one of his wives. Whoever it was would have to take his or her place on the killing stone and have their heads cut off by the Egbos. To this, all the people agreed and said they would like to hear what the young man had to say. The young man then walked round the square and bowed to the king and the people and asked the question, "Am I not worthy to be the son of any chief in the country?" And all the people answered, "Yes." The boy then brought his sister out into the middle, leading her by the hand. She was a very beautiful girl and well made. When everyone had looked at her, he said, "Is not my sister worthy to be any chief's daughter?" And the people replied that she was worthy of being anyone's daughter, even the king's. Then he called his mother Adiaha, and she came out, looking very beautiful with her best cloth and beads on, and all the people cheered as they had never seen a finer woman. The boy then asked them, "Is this woman worthy of being a king's wife?" And a shout went up from everyone present that she would be a proper wife for the king, and looked as if she would be the mother of plenty of fine, healthy sons. Then the boy pointed out the jealous woman who was sitting next to the king, and told the people his story, how that his mother, who had 2 skins, was the spider's daughter, how she had married the king, and how the head wife was jealous and had made a bad juju for the king, which made him forget his wife, how she had persuaded the king to throw himself and his sister into the river, which, as they all knew, had been done. But the water juju had saved both of them and had brought them up. Then the boy said, "I leave the king and all of you people to judge my case. If I have done wrong, let me be killed on the stone by the Egbos. If, on the other hand, the woman has done evil, then let the Egbos deal with her as you may decide." When the king knew that the wrestler was his son, he was very glad, and told the Egbos to take the jealous woman away and punish her in accordance with their laws. The Egbos decided that the woman was a witch, so they took her into the forest and tied her up to a stake and gave her 200 lashes with a whip made from hippopotamus hide, and then burnt her alive so that she could not make any more trouble, and her ashes were thrown into the river. The king then embraced his wife and daughter and told all the people that she, Adiaha, was his proper wife and would be the queen for the future. When the palaver was over, Adiaha was dressed in fine clothes and beads and carried back in state to the palace by the king's servants. That night, the king gave a big feast to all his subjects and told them how glad he was to get back his beautiful wife, whom he had never known properly before, also his son, who was stronger than all men, and his fine daughter. The feast continued for 166 days, and the king made a law that if any woman was found out getting medicine against her husband, she should be killed at once. Then the king built 3 new compounds and placed many slaves in them, both men and women. 1 compound he gave to his wife, another to his son, and the 3rd he gave to his daughter. They all lived together quite happily for some years until the king died, when his son came to the throne and ruled in his stead. Moral: jealousy kills. Don't be jealous of your neighbor. Instead, find a way to believe in yourself. The King's Magic Drum. Ephraim Duke was an ancient king of Calabar. He was a peaceful man and did not like war. He had a wonderful drum, the property of which, when it was beaten, was always to provide plenty of good food and drink. So, whenever any country declared war against him, he used to call all his enemies together and beat his drum. Then, to the surprise of everyone, instead of fighting, the people found tables spread with all sorts of dishes: fish, fufu, palm oil chop, soup, cooked yams and okras, and plenty of palm wine for everybody. In this way, he kept all the country quiet and sent his enemies away with full stomachs and in a happy and contented frame of mind. There was only one drawback to possessing the drum, and that was if the owner of the drum walked over any stick on the road or stepped over a fallen tree, all the food would immediately go bad, and 300 able men would appear with sticks and whips and beat the owner of the drum and all the invited guests very severely. Ephraim Duke was a rich man. He had many farms and hundreds of slaves, a large store of kennels on the beach, and many punctions of palm oil. He also had 50 wives and many children. The wives were all fine women and healthy. They were also good mothers, and all of them had plenty of children, which was good for the king's house. Every few months, the king used to issue invitations to all his subjects to come to a big feast. Even the wild animals were invited: the elephants, hippopotami, leopards, bush cows, and antelopes used to come, for in those days there was no trouble, as they were friendly with man. And when they were at the feast, they did not kill one another. All the people and the animals as well were envious of the king's drum and wanted to possess it, but the king would not part with it. One morning, Ituen, one of the king's wives, took her little daughter down to the spring to wash her, as she was covered with yaws, which are bad sores all over the body. The tortoise happened to be up a palm tree just over the spring, cutting nuts for his midday meal. And while he was cutting, one of the nuts fell to the ground just in front of the child. The little girl, seeing the good food, cried for it, and the mother, not knowing any better, picked up the palm nut and gave it to her daughter. Directly the tortoise saw this, he climbed down the tree and asked the woman where his palm nut was. She replied that she had given it to her child to eat. Then the tortoise, who very much wanted the king's drum, thought he would make plenty palaver over this and force the king to give him the drum. So he said to the mother of the child, "I am a poor man, and I climbed the tree to get food for myself and my family. Then you took my palm nut and gave it to your child. I shall tell the whole matter to the king and see what he has to say when he hears that one of his wives has stolen my food." For this, as everyone knows, is a very serious crime according to native custom. Ifeyinwa then said to the tortoise, "I saw your palm nut lying on the ground, and thinking it had fallen from the tree, I gave it to my little girl to eat, but I did not steal it. My husband, the king, is a rich man, and if you have any complaint to make against me or my child, I will take you before him." So when she had finished washing her daughter at the spring, she took the tortoise to her husband and told him what had taken place. The king then asked the tortoise what he would accept as compensation for the loss of his palm nut, and offered him money, cloth, kernels or palm oil, all of which things the tortoise refused one after the other. The king then said to the tortoise, "What will you take? You may have anything you like." And the tortoise immediately pointed to the king's drum and said that it was the only thing he wanted. In order to get rid of the tortoise, the king said, "Very well, take the drum." But he never told the tortoise about the bad things that would happen to him if he stepped over a fallen tree or walked over a stick on the road. The tortoise was very glad at this and carried the drum home in triumph to his wife and said, "I am now a rich man and shall do no more work. Whenever I want food, all I have to do is beat this drum and food will immediately be brought to me and plenty to drink." His wife and children were very pleased when they heard this and asked the tortoise to get food at once, as they were all hungry. This the tortoise was only too pleased to do, as he wished to show off his newly acquired wealth, and was also rather hungry himself. So he beat the drum in the same way as he had seen the king do when he wanted something to eat, and immediately plenty of food appeared, so they all sat down and made a great feast. The tortoise did this for 3 days, and everything went well. All his children got fat and had as much as they could possibly eat. He was therefore very proud of his drum, and in order to display his riches, he sent invitations to the king and all the people and animals to come to a feast. When the people received their invitations, they laughed, as they knew the tortoise was very poor. So very few attended the feast. But the king, knowing about the drum, came. And when the tortoise beat the drum, the food was brought as usual in great profusion. And all the people sat down and enjoyed their meal very much. They were much astonished that the poor tortoise should be able to entertain so many people, and they told all their friends what fine dishes had been placed before them, and that they had never had a better dinner. The people who had not gone were very sorry when they heard this, as a good feast at somebody else's expense is not provided every day. After the feast, all the people looked upon the tortoise as one of the richest men in the kingdom, and he was very much respected in consequence. No one except the king could understand how the poor tortoise could suddenly entertain so lavishly, but they all made up their minds that if the tortoise ever gave another feast, they would not refuse again. When the tortoise had been in possession of the drum for a few weeks, he became lazy and did no work, but went out about the city boasting of his riches, and took to drinking too much. One day, after he had been drinking a lot of palm wine at a distant farm, he started home carrying his drum. But having had too much to drink, he did not notice a stick in the path. He walked over the stick, and of course, the juju was broken at once. But he did not know this, as nothing happened at the time, and eventually he arrived at his house very tired and still not very well from having drunk too much. He threw the drum into a corner and went to sleep. When he woke up in the morning, the tortoise began to feel hungry, and as his wife and children were calling out for food, he beat the drum. But instead of food being brought, the house was filled with Egbo men, who beat the tortoise, his wife, and children badly. At this, the tortoise was very angry and said to himself, "I asked everyone to a feast, but only a few came, and they had plenty to eat and drink. Now, when I want food for myself and my family, the Egbos come and beat me. Well, I will let the other people share the same fate, as I do not see why I and my family should be beaten when I have given a feast to all people." He therefore at once sent out invitations to all the men and animals to come to a big dinner the next day at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. When the time arrived, many people came, as they did not wish to lose the chance of a free meal a second time. Even the sick men, the lame, and the blind got their friends to lead them to the feast. When they had all arrived, with the exception of the king and his wives, who sent excuses, the tortoise beat his drum as usual, and then quickly hid himself under a bench where he could not be seen. His wife and children he had sent away before the feast, as he knew what would surely happen. Directly he had beaten the drum, 300 able men appeared with whips and started flogging all the guests who could not escape, as the doors had been fastened. The beating went on for 2 hours, and the people were so badly punished that many of them had to be carried home on the backs of their friends. The leopard was the only one who escaped, as directly he saw the Egbo men arrived, he knew that things were likely to be unpleasant, so he gave a big spring and jumped right out of the compound. When the tortoise was satisfied with the beating the people had received, he crept to the door and opened it. The people then ran away, and when the tortoise gave a certain tap on the drum, all the able men vanished. The people who had been beaten were so angry and made so much palaver with the tortoise that he made up his mind to return the drum to the king the next day. So, in the morning, the tortoise went to the king and brought the drum with him. He told the king that he was not satisfied with the drum and wished to exchange it for something else. He did not mind so much what the king gave him, so long as he got full value for the drum, and he was quite willing to accept a certain number of slaves, or a few farms, or the equivalent in cloth or rods. The king, however, refused to do this, but as he was rather sorry for the tortoise, he said he would present him with a magic fufu tree, which would provide the tortoise and his family with food, provided he kept a certain condition. This the tortoise gladly consented to do. Now this fufu tree only bore fruit once a year, but every day it dropped fufu and soup on the ground, and the condition was that the owner should gather sufficient food for the day once and not return again for more. The tortoise, when he had thanked the king for his generosity, went home to his wife and told her to bring her calabashes to the tree. She did so, and they gathered plenty of fufu and soup, quite sufficient for the whole family for that day, and went back to their house very happy. That night, they all feasted and enjoyed themselves. But one of the sons, who was very greedy, thought to himself, I wonder where my father gets all this good food from. I must ask him. So in the morning he said to his father, "Tell me, where do you get all this fufu and soup from?" But his father refused to tell him, as his wife, who was a cunning woman, said, "If we let our children know the secret of the fufu tree, someday, when they are hungry, after we have got our daily supply, one of them may go to the tree and gather more, which will break the juju." But the envious son, being determined to get plenty of food for himself, decided to track his father to the place where he obtained the food. This was rather difficult to do, as the tortoise always went out alone and took the greatest care to prevent anyone following him. The boy, however, soon thought of a plan and got a calabash with a long neck and a hole in the end. He filled the calabash with wood ashes, which he obtained from the fire, and then got a bag which his father always carried on his back when he went out to get food. In the bottom of the bag, the boy then made a small hole and inserted the calabash with the neck downwards, so that when his father walked to the fufu tree, he would leave a small trail of wood ashes behind him. Then, when his father, having slung his bag over his back as usual, set out to get the daily supply of food, his greedy son followed the trail of the wood ashes, taking great care to hide himself and not to let his father perceive that he was being followed. At last, the tortoise arrived at the tree and placed his calabashes on the ground and collected the food for the day, the boy watching him from a distance. When his father had finished and went home, the boy also returned, and having had a good meal, said nothing to his parents but went to bed. The next morning, he got some of his brothers, and after his father had finished getting the daily supply, they went to the tree and collected much fufu and soup, and so broke the juju. At daylight, the tortoise went to the tree as usual, but he could not find it, as during the night the whole bush had grown up, and the fufu tree was hidden from sight. There was nothing to be seen but a dense mass of prickly tai-tai palm. Then the tortoise at once knew that someone had broken the juju and had gathered fufu from the tree twice in the same day. So he returned very sadly to his house and told his wife. He then called all his family together and told them what had happened, and asked them who had done this evil thing. They all denied having had anything to do with the tree, so the tortoise, in despair, brought all his family to the place where the fufu tree had been, but which was now all prickly tai-tai palm, and said, "My dear wife and children, I have done all I can for you, but you have broken my juju. You must therefore for the future live on the tai-tai palm." So they made their home underneath the prickly tree, and from that day, you will always find tortoises living under the prickly tai-tai palm, as they have nowhere else to go for food. Moral: be grateful for what you have. When you become greedy, you will likely end up with less than you had before, or nothing at all. Ituen and the King's Wife. Ituen was a young man of Calabar. He was the only child of his parents, and they were extremely fond of him, as he was of fine proportions and very good to look upon. They were poor people, and when Ituen grew up and became a man, he had very little money indeed. In fact, he had so little food that every day it was his custom to go to the market carrying an empty bag, into which he used to put anything eatable he could find after the market was over. At this time, Ifeyinwa was king. He was an old man, but he had plenty of wives. One of these women, named Atem, was quite young and very good-looking. She did not like her old husband, but wished for a young and handsome husband. She therefore told her servant to go around the town and the market to try and find such a man, and to bring him at night by the side door to her house. And she herself would let him in and would take care that her husband did not discover him. That day, the servant went all round the town, but failed to find any young man good-looking enough. She was just returning to report her ill success when, on passing through the marketplace, she saw Ituen picking up the remains of corn and other things which had been left on the ground. She was immediately struck with his fine appearance and strength, and saw that he was just the man to make a proper lover for her mistress. So she went up to him and said that the queen had sent for him, as she was so taken with his good looks. At first, Ituen was frightened and refused to go, as he knew that if the king discovered him, he would be killed. However, after much persuasion, he consented and agreed to go to the queen's side door when it was dark. When night came, he went with great fear and trembling and knocked very softly at the queen's door. The door was opened at once by the queen herself, who was dressed in all her best clothes and had many necklaces, beads, and anklets on. Directly she saw Ituen, she fell in love with him at once, and praised his good looks and his shapely limbs. She then told her servant to bring water and clothes, and after he had had a good wash and put on a clean cloth, he rejoined the queen. She hid him in her house all the night. In the morning, when he wished to go, she would not let him, but although it was very dangerous, she hid him in the house and secretly conveyed food and clothes to him. Ituen stayed there for 2 weeks, and then he said that it was time for him to go and see his mother. But the queen persuaded him to stay another week, much against his will. When the time came for him to depart, the queen got together 50 carriers with presents for Ituen's mother, who she knew was a poor woman. 10 slaves carried 300 rods, the other 40 carried yams, pepper, salt, tobacco, and cloth. When all the presents arrived, Ituen's mother was very pleased and embraced her son, and noticed with pleasure that he was looking well, and was dressed in much finer clothes than usual. But when she heard that he had attracted the queen's attention, she was frightened, as she knew the penalty imposed on anyone who attracted the attention of one of the king's wives. Ituen stayed for a month in his parents' house and worked on the farm, but the queen could not be without her lover any longer. So she sent for him to go to her house at once. Ituen went again, and as before, arrived at night, when the queen was delighted to see him again. In the middle of the night, some of the king's servants, who had been told the story by the slaves who had carried the presents to Ituen's mother, came into the queen's room and surprised her there with Ituen. They hastened to the king and told him what they had seen. Ituen was then made a prisoner, and the king sent out to all his people to attend at the palaver house to hear the case tried. He also ordered 8 egbos to attend, armed with machetes. When the case was tried, Ituen was found guilty, and the king told the 8 ebo men to take him into the bush and deal with him according to native custom. The egbos then took Ituen into the bush and tied him up to a tree. Then with a sharp knife, they cut off his lower jaw and carried it to the king. When the queen heard the fate of her lover, she was very sad and cried for 3 days. This made the king angry. So he told the egbos to deal with his wife and her servant according to their law. They took the queen and the servant into the bush, where Ituen was still tied up to the tree, dying and in great pain. Then, as the queen had nothing to say in her defense, they tied her and the girl up to different trees and cut the queen's lower jaw off in the same way as they had her lovers. The egbos then put out both the eyes of the servant and left all three to die of starvation. The king then made an Ebo law that for the future no one belonging to the Ituen's family was to go into the market on market day, and that no one was to pick up the rubbish in the market. The king made an exception to the law in favor of the vulture and the dog, who were not considered very fine people, and would not be likely to run off with one of the king's wives. And that is why you still find vultures and dogs doing scavenger in the marketplaces, even at the present time. Moral: when you make a commitment, it is important that you keep it, as you may sacrifice your life if you do not. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the story, hit the subscribe button. If you didn't enjoy the story, still hit the subscribe button because you may like the next one. Until next time, enjoy life. Finding Africa.